Hello and welcome back to the podcast. As you may have noticed, we've had a bit of a rebrand while we've been off air, and NG Meets has become Not What I'm Talking About. We spent a lot of time thinking about the name, and we've decided it was time to freshen things up a bit. As part of that, we're also moving the release date of podcasts, and we'll now be releasing new episodes on Thursdays. And as ever, they'll be at ngdigital.podbean.com. And then also from the likes of Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podcast Addict, or wherever else you get your podcasts. We're also looking at plans of a new website and things like that will make it even easier to get the podcast and information on it. So hopefully you'll enjoy the episodes we've got coming forward. The format will be the same. We'll be sitting and chatting to people from and connected to Nottingham. Such as this week's guest, who is David Phillips, who is head teacher at Chilwell School in Nottingham. Obviously, we all know what the past year has been like, with furlough, working from home, places closing, lockdowns, shielding, things like that. And of course, one of the biggest upheavals, particularly for families, was the closure of schools and the movement to online and homeschooling. So I contacted David to have a chat with him about how that's been from the school's point of view. Chilwell School is actually the school that my oldest child goes to, so I know a lot about the provisions they've put in place, and I've been very impressed with what they've done, not only in the provisions they've put on and how that's improved over time, but also in the way they've communicated with parents and children, and also the community, and the way they've helped. They did things like taking a van out to provide stationery equipment during holidays ready for children to use, and things like that. And it's obviously been a tough time for everyone, for children, for schools, for parents, for teaching staff, and everyone that works in education. And it was interesting to talk to David about how the schools adapted to that, the impacts it's obviously had, what it might mean going forward, particularly in terms of things like examinations, because while we've seen this year's exams, for example, are going to remain based on assessment like last year, there's also the thought that even if schools are now fully open and do stay open from now on, children that are going to be taking exams in the next few years have still been massively impacted over this period, and that needs to be taken into consideration. We also talked about obviously how they've had schools, teachers have had to learn things like handling the social distancing, the testing that's taken place. So we had a chat about that, and just about the lockdown in general. It's a fascinating chat. It's interesting, obviously, always interesting to talk to people from different walks about how this has impacted, businesses, charities, organisations, individuals, and the like. And as I say, schooling has been one that's suffered the biggest impact, but also one of the ones that's been maybe the most controversial. A lot of people unhappy with the school lockdown. Teachers unjustly coming under a lot of criticism, for the way it's been handled, despite having to go out of their way to work so hard. Not only providing online provisions, but also still teaching in schools at the same time. So I thought it was very important to try and speak to people that are within education about what this period's been like from them. So this is a fascinating chat. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Please do let me know what you think about it. As ever, you can find us on social media. It's facebook.com/NG Digital, or on Twitter at NGDigitalUK. And as ever, you can find the podcast ngdigital.podbean.com, or wherever you get your podcasts from. So thanks for joining us. Welcome to Not What I'm Talking About, and this is Not What I'm Talking About with David Phillips of Chilwell School.
So to kick things off, I thought I was looking at it, and I think, if I'm right, that this week is actually a year to the week that the last schools actually closed at the beginning of the very first lockdown.
That's right. And we are. It's the anniversary week, basically. And actually, yes, I still remember that. It was really odd in the lead up to it. You kind of, I think, a number of us thought that something big was going to happen, that there was going to be some big moment, and in fact, actually, really oddly, I seem to remember in the weeks leading up to our closure, it actually just felt a little bit messy. We started to have increased absence. We started to have people who were actually not in school, people who were not well, and actually, I should have realised, but actually, it's never quite as kind of neat as you close one door and open another door, and that's what it was for schools. I think last year it was suddenly we then got this announcement that actually everything was just going to shut down, and I remember speaking to the staff, and actually it was a very emotional meeting. That actually our regular day pattern of what we were expecting to do was just completely just going to be thrown up in the air, and none of us really knew at that time what we were going to do. We'd spent the week encouraging students to collect as many of their exercise books and study books as they would need, just in case they were not going to be coming back into school. And actually we managed that, but then suddenly they were gone, and it's a most peculiar situation.
Yeah, it was very strange, because I think, as you said there was definitely a sense something was coming. Obviously, we could all see what was happening, in places like Italy, where they were already starting to close down. So I think there was a sense of it coming, but when it did actually come, it was very quick. It was kind of like, I think it was like a Monday night, and I know I was actually we had already actually stopped. We were all on self isolation because my younger child had been sent home. But then I think it was the Monday night, and it was just like Friday, everything, schools shut, and it was just like, so though you kind of sensed something was coming, when it did come, it was so quick. And I imagine, obviously, that for you then, because obviously you still got kids in that last week, but at the same time you then got the knowledge that as of the week after, you've got to try and somehow put something into place that quickly, which must have been.
And I still remember it being, I think all of us were kind of not sure how long this would last, and I remember having conversations with people just thinking, well, all that'll happen is it'll just be that maybe we'll just extend the Easter holiday for a little bit longer, and then we'll be able to come back and move on. So we kind of threw together very, very quickly a kind of a package of support for students, and let that run, I think, up until the Easter break. But it was because it was thrown together very quickly. It had the disadvantage of being almost like kind of opening the fridge door to be able to sort of see what's in there and take out, and no real kind of like monitoring, or no real sort of like structure of what that might look like. It was in effect work to be, I suppose, for just be getting on with. And we just realised that wasn't going to be sustainable. That actually it would just mean that, in effect, to carry on the metaphor, that fridge would just be getting more and more stacked full of stuff, out of date stuff that you couldn't quite find, that would end up at the back of the fridge. And we just thought, you can't organise learning and a curriculum like that. Which then led us to then think, what are we already doing? What are we already using within school? And that just took us back to the whole idea of Google Drive and Google Classrooms, which allowed us then to use that facility to help us structure that learning and structure our curriculum.
Yeah, it's like you say, it was very fast, but over time it developed, and it was very interesting and incredible to see the way systems were put in place. And one thing I've often said is, I wonder what would have happened if this had happened when I was at school, when none of this remote learning would have been possible or anything like that.
I don't think any of us can imagine what it would have been like. But I mean, and again, when I was at school, there was no such thing as the internet. If you wanted a book to be able to use, you either had to get it from your teacher, or you'd get it from the library, or you'd make a trip into town to be able to order something from the library, which might take a few weeks. There was nothing like that at all. And I think the internet has served us well, I think, in terms of being able to make sure that to a certain extent that learning has not been as lost as perhaps it could have been, and our communication has been able to keep strong with families and communities.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, when you look at it now, as you said, it's been a year, and it's only just that the children have gone back for the second time. So without those technologies and facilities available, you were looking at pretty much a lost year.
Yes,
and that's really impossible to imagine the impact that would have had.
Although, and again, I never want to stretch this comparison too far, but we see, in the news all the time, young people who are fleeing war-torn environments, who have had their education disrupted through having to move from one country to another, perhaps in dangerous situations, or having had their school destroyed. I mean, again, seeing stories about that happening in Syria. This disruption to children's lives unfortunately happens right across the world.
Yeah.
And I think we have in our society felt quite cushioned, I suppose, from that level of disruption. But I think if we look at the experience that's happened around the world about how resilient people are and communities are, and how successful people can be in coming back from situations like that, then I know that we shouldn't be facing this with pessimism. That we can always have some hope that children will not necessarily bounce back, because I think bounce back puts people back where they were. Yeah. And I think what we've done is I think we've all learnt a lot about ourselves and about how communities run and how we need to run our lives through this.
Definitely, yeah. It's I think, in many ways it's been a very good, obviously it's been a terrible situation, but in terms of the way communities have come together, not just with school, but when we saw people, that were going out and picking up shopping for neighbours that were isolating, and, people were talking to neighbours and people on the street more in a lockdown than they ever actually did when you could just pop over almost.
Absolutely. I think that sense of community is certainly something that we felt as a school. I felt that we have done our best to be able to try to make sure that we are, an important spoke, not necessarily the hub of that wheel, but a really significant spoke that's kind of holding that wheel of the community together. And the response that we've been getting back from the community has been so strong in terms of the support that we've had, the thanks that we've got, because it's tough. It's tough for all the staff who are working within school to be able to, shoulder that responsibility of trying to make sure that students are moving on, especially when, weirdly, up until recently, we were all in online situations where we'd made the decision that it wasn't necessarily appropriate for students to have the cameras on. So that kind of disembodied experience over the internet has been tough to manage, and they've done really well. So the support that we've had has been crucial for that.
Yeah, I think it's been really good. I mean, one of the things that I thought was really important that your school did was the sort of weekly phone calls. Even talking to not just to the parents but to the students as well, and just that feeling that the care's there is so important to kids, because it's a rough time. I don't know. I'm amazed at how well actually the children have handled it, because it's hard for for all of us, but at that age, when you're such social, group people, that's you're used to mixing and spending all your day with mixing, and then you just have that cut off. I think they've adapted to the situation so well. I don't think they necessarily get enough credit for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's about getting for all of us in our lives, I think we need a kind of combination of routine and excitement. And I think this has really kind of knocked that kind of element of how people are managing their lives. So, the routine of school, we want to make school as interesting as possible, but let's face it, it is a routine. You wake up in the morning like people going to work, you go to school, you undertake a day at school, and then you go back home again. And that routine, that regular routine is something that many people then find quite disruptive when they've not got that. As you see when people have retired from a lifetime of work and actually find themselves a bit disorientated and lost unless they've planned it really carefully. So that regular contact with tutors was something that we wanted to build in that routine. We wanted to build in the way that in terms we organised Google Classroom to be able to make sure there was a routine of learning. The excitement is the really difficult bit, because I see it now in all the conversations that we have. That so many of us have there's that sense we've all feeling, well, we've had enough now. We want to get back to things we're doing. And like days like today when we've got comic relief, when actually I'd said to as many staff as possible, let's just make sure, I know we can't see the smiles, but let's just try and bring smiles to people's faces as much as possible. And that's great. Today is different. It's and I celebrate the fact that today is different, because yesterday and the day before were kind of merging into one. And I think we all got to try to find things about what can we do. And that's where I think that ties into, the excitement that I think communities have had, because people have thought, my regular routine is disrupted, but maybe I'll do something different. Maybe I'll feel something that gives myself some value. And that might well be helping a neighbour, or organising something, or being part of something else, whether it's, clapping on your front doorstep or whatever. That I think all of us search for that, to try to find that element of a combination of routine and excitement.
Yeah, and so many of us, I think, have had to become Zoom experts over the last year.
Absolutely,
And even things like it's been able to keep like my younger child being able to still engage with things like beavers and things like that. That would have not been possible. So obviously, with the kids are now, or the children are now back again. We had obviously they went back in September, and then again in January, which again I think we all see sort of coming, and there are a lot of questions can be asked about why the decision was made when it was made, when it was quite clear. I think to many of us, but before the Christmas holiday, I think that it was going to have to be closed and locked down again. And obviously the second lockdown was different, because I guess by then as well, the schools had established a much better structure in place. Like you said, you developed systems, and you could see that immediately upon the second lockdown, the kids were able to get into things a lot quicker, and obviously and continue on. But now they're back. They've just, I think this is the first 4 week back.
It is the first one, yeah.
How's that been? Obviously, you had the testing. I saw the video you did of the testing.
Yeah.
And I've obviously spoken to my son about the testing, and that seems to have worked very well, given how. I mean, I don't know how it must be very difficult trying to get children to socially isolate when they've not seen each other for
absolutely
months.
And I think about the things that we've experienced over the last year, and I would never have dreamt that we'd be engaged in some of the activities that we've been involved in as a school and as staff. And the testing is exactly part of that. Our Christmas was disrupted because we were asked by the government to be able to make sure that testing centres were ready. So that was a lot of work that we put in place that then actually sat there empty while we were in lockdown. But again, you approach these things with some element of trepidation. You put as much planning in as possible, and yet, as we've talked about earlier, the positive way that the children have reacted. I had in my mind, how could we set up maybe a separate room if we had children who were going to be upset when we were going through the testing, and you know what? We virtually had no instance of that at all. It was so incredibly smooth. And that was down to the fact that I think, we tried all sorts of things about sending out information about what to expect. I did think that actually, whilst I did put that video out, it wasn't about the detail of the actual test itself, but just to try to make sure that the students were familiar in some ways about what the environment was going to be like around them. And that's what we did before they came back last September, when we planned, these are the entrances that you're going to be coming in, because it's going to be different from what you normally expect. But they've responded really well. We are back into the rhythm, in effect, of what the students were doing when they returned to us in September. When we saw them come back in, for a couple of days last week and then fully this week, they've again readopted those routines that were embedded. And it's overall, those routines are positive because they offer security, and that comes down to what about education's all about. It really, we've talked about routines before, and it is that if routines are in place, I think people feel an element of security and control about what's going on. And that's why I think routines are so important first thing in the morning, within lessons, so that students actually know, I know what to expect.
Yeah.
I know what's expected of me. And in this situation now, when the stakes are much higher in terms of the disruption that can happen to individual students or to even year groups if we have to send them home, the impact it could have on our relatives and elderly relatives or teaching staff and support staff within school, the stakes are high. So we try to make sure that let's just focus on the detail of the routines. Let's focus on the learning, and let's make sure that we don't need to then spend our time fretting too much.
Yeah, and I think as well for children, because this is such a strange time, like say everything's been thrown out, and it still is, and we're still some time away. Even in best case scenario, we're still quite a long way away from getting back to what you might call a normality. I think I know that school is obviously different now, bubbles and mask wearing and social distancing, but just that normality of getting up, going into school, taking part of school when everything else at the minute is still so abnormal, I think is a big thing for children. And just being able to spend some time with people outside of their own homes, their friend groups, and then the teachers.
And seeing the students come back into school, seeing them being able to enjoy each other's company again is fantastic. I mean, that's why most of us go into education. We want to see that excitement and working with young people, and we've seen that this week, and it's been great.
Excellent. One of the big, obviously, issues beyond adapting the school and the day and things has obviously been exams. Last year, obviously, was very on the fly, and there were obviously a lot of issues. Things were changed and the way they were graded. And I think you've recently talked about what the plan is this year. I think it's mostly it's assessment based and things like that. But obviously I imagine not just for the children it's affected, but also the teachers is very stressful and anxious time, because we're talking about children that are about to go forward with their future, and these results obviously have a massive impact on that.
And actually, I think schools are now in a position that I think we fully accept the responsibility that we've got. Yesterday, in fact, I was chairing a discussion with the head of Ofqual at the ASCL conference, and again was putting questions to him about the clarity that we need to have in place to make sure that students and their parents have confidence in the school and in the system. We've run sessions for parents and for students to be able to lay out quite clearly for them the process that we're going to be going through. In everything we do, we just try to make sure that we are transparent, so that there's nothing hidden. This is what we are. This is what we do. This is how we are planning on doing things. Sometimes we'll get things wrong, hopefully not too frequently. And I think the process that we're approaching for these summer exams is based upon developing a confidence in our staff that the procedures they've got in place are going to be correct, that we're going to support them in that, making sure that students and parents are aware of what we're doing. It is made a bit more difficult because as yet the exam boards have not yet issued their support materials. We're expecting that to come out just before Easter. They've also announced it's going to go out publicly just after Easter. So we can't wait for that. You know, one would have argued that perhaps the initial decision by the DfE last autumn to insist that exams were going to go ahead as normal, we could probably see was an accident waiting to happen. And we've had to respond quickly. We have said to parents, we always like a plan B, and we had a plan B back in September, because not all of us necessarily believed that the government's optimism was in the right place. So we've already started the process of collecting assessments, collecting evidence, and that students are then clear on what they need to do up to Easter and in that crucial next half term.
Excellent. And I think it's going to be interesting, obviously, going ahead. You know, if things go as best case scenario, and you know, that's being potentially overly hopeful. But if we said that school, you know, if we looked at it and then after the summer holidays, schools are running more or less back to how they were prior to the lockdown, you know, the social distancing has been relaxed and things like that. Where do you see sort of going forward with exams? Because obviously the students that are going to be going into exams in 2022 are still going to obviously be impacted.
Yeah.
And in fact, students all through the next generation.
Absolutely. And there are already plans that are being made by Ofqual and the exam boards in order to address how grading will be undertaken in 2022. Because yes, we do absolutely have to recognise that the disruption has been keenly felt by those people who have been facing examinations in the summer of 21 and 20. But we do need to think about the long term, and it is essential that actually we review what needs to be in place, and not just at a school level and a national level, what needs to be in place for those students who are coming through and facing examinations into the future. If examinations are in fact used in the same way, it was clear, and Ofqual have made it clear that they believe exams are the best way to be able to assess students' understanding. But we also need to recognise these are strange times, and in strange times, you perhaps need to sometimes amend your planning.
Yeah, this is it. This is you know, the effects of this pandemic and lockdown are going to be long felt. It's not a case of once, you know, lockdown's over, we go back to normal. Over, you know, beyond not just school, all through education, economically, the impact of this is going to be, you know, generational, I think, at least. So
yeah, and I think when people sometimes say normal, they sometimes think that is the same as it was before, and I don't think that when we come back to school in September, we will ever go back to as it was before. And it probably would be wrong to do so, because we all learn things and we all amend things and we all tweak things in our lives to be able to make sure that our lives or our learning are better. And I think it's true to say that in being put into a situation that none of us wanted to be in, schools across the country have learnt things and have learnt how to do things which we wouldn't want to lose.
Yeah,
we'd want to make sure that we still hold on to some of the aspects of what we do. Certainly that the online provision is infinitely better, and actually was something that many schools would want to work towards, about having their curriculum accessible and online, because under normal circumstances, people break their legs. Under normal circumstances, students unfortunately have long-term illnesses or are not able to be in school. And as far as possible that you can have an online curriculum, which clearly is not going to be as effective and as strong as children sitting in classrooms and enjoying, you know, direct teaching from a teacher and the support of their friends and colleagues. But there is something there. And I think it was always a challenge, I think, for schools to be able to support the learning of students whose lives had been disrupted in some ways. And we've had to face that because everybody's life now has been disrupted.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's something that's come up talking across, you know, with universities. We've seen the sort of the working world, working from home now is something I think that a lot of people that's gonna stick around. Maybe not fully, but at least the more flexible. People are going to expect a more flexible approach to working from home and things like that.
Oh, I think so. And I think actually, I know we're focusing upon schools, but I think the working environment is going to be something we're going to see a much more significant, I think, change in that. And when that happens, you then start thinking about what the nature of city centres become. And we've already seen the kind of the impact upon industries which rely upon workers being located very much in a city centre environment. Now, if we move fundamentally away from that, I think we'll see cities changing quite significantly in terms of how they're made up.
Yeah, it could be interesting in the same sense as then what that means for smaller edge of the county towns. Places like Beeston.
Exactly. Yeah, it may well be that actually, Beeston becomes much more vibrant in many ways because its population stays within that area.
Yeah.
Because that's where they live and where they work, and clearly that already happens for many people in their lives. But it's also a place where people commute from or commute into.
Yeah, it's. I think you look back through history, and any time we have a major, life changing happening like has happened now, the impact is everlasting. Effectively, it's fundamental changes.
Yes, yeah.
Well, I know you're obviously really busy, as you say. Not only have you got all the children back, but it's also Red Nose Day. So I wanted to say thank you very much for taking some time out. I know we've been sort of planning this for a while, but I think when we first spoke was about 2 days before they announced the reopening of schools. So it was an interesting timing, but it's been great to sort of speak to you about this and find out. Obviously I'm aware of the side of it from the pupil side. Having children that have been home learning, but it's been interesting to see. And I also think it's important to acknowledge the work that teachers and all staff in schools and all education have been putting in, which I don't think they necessarily always get the appreciation they deserve.
Darren, thank you. Appreciate that. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
So a massive thank you there to David Phillips for taking time to us. As you can imagine, it was a hectic period. We recorded that episode at the end of the first full week back for the school and also on Red Nose Day, so it was quite a hectic time. So it was much appreciated that he managed to take half an hour to have a chat with us about things. And as you can see, it's been an interesting period for schools and it could be interesting going forward, but it's fantastic to see the way schools have managed during this period. I think we have to give a lot of credit to teachers, support staff, everybody that works within education, and of course the pupils. Things might be starting to ease up, but I think we've still got a long road ahead, and we don't yet know what winter and times like that might be, and the impact of this is going to be profound on everyone, but in particular I think children. So that's going to be something that we need to look at going ahead. As David says, the impact on examinations isn't just about these people directly impacted by being unable to take their examinations within school, but also children that have seen their education massively disrupted, because although schools have gone out of their way to provide these online provisions and support, not everyone has been in the same situation in terms of receiving it, and it isn't the same. The initial lockdown, schools had to then try and quickly adapt and put in systems. I think anyone with children would have seen the difference between the first and second lockdown, but even so, different children will have handled these situations in different ways, and that's all got to be taken account for to try and make sure these children still have the best chance going forward. And I know schools are going out their way to do that. So again, thank you to David. Thank you to anyone in education for what you've done. I know as a parent of 3 children of varying ages, I've been extremely impressed by what the schools have done during this very difficult time, and I'm sure many others are. Let me know what you think. If you want to let us know, as ever, contact us ngdigital.podbean.com, where you can find the podcast, and on social media. Twitter is @ngdigitaluk, facebook.com/ngdigital. We've got more episodes lined up. Keep an eye on those social media sites for announcements of upcoming guests. But in the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoyed the new episode. This has been Not What I'm Talking About. Until the next time, goodbye.